Mohism, universal love and the forgotten philosophy. Beliefs, ethics, and the school of Mozi, a craftsman's son who proposed universal love as a rational principle 400 years before Christianity. A philosopher who was anti-war, anti-luxury, and strictly logical. A school so disciplined it functioned like a monastic military order. And then, silence. The philosophy that almost changed everything. Paronal writings seen as May 2026 Hallgrissity Q Produe.mr. Contents. Introduction, the philosophy that almost won. Part 1. Historical context, China's warring states period. Part 2. Mozi, the man and his background. Part 3. Jian I, universal love, the central teaching. Part 4. Fei Gong, against offensive war. Part 5. Ji Yong, against luxury and waste. Part 6. Shang Xian, exalting the worthy, Mohist meritocracy. Part 7. Shang Tong, conforming upward, Mohist political theory. Part 8. Tianji, the will of heaven, Mohist theology. Part 9. Ming Gui, affirming the existence of spirits. Part 10. Fei Yue, against music, the most misunderstood doctrine. Part 11. Mohist logic and the canon. Part 12. Mohist science, optics, mechanics, and geometry. Part 13. The Mohist community, a school like no other. Part 14. The suppression of Mohism. Part 15. Mohism's modern revival and relevance. Part 16. Halagricity convergences. Introduction. In the intellectual history of the world, there are very few cases of a philosophy that rose to compete with the dominant tradition of its civilization and then was so thoroughly suppressed that it was almost completely erased. Mohism is one of them. For approximately 2 centuries, roughly from 400 to 200 BCE, the Mohist school was one of the 2 most important philosophical traditions in China, competing directly with Confucianism for intellectual dominance during the period of the 100 schools of thought. Mencius, the great Confucian philosopher, wrote that the words of Yang Zhu and Mozi fill the world, suggesting that Mohism had achieved a reach and influence comparable to Confucianism itself. Then the Qin dynasty unified China through military conquest and established the first Chinese imperial state, and Mohism's anti-war, anti-authoritarianism, and proto-democratic elements made it politically inconvenient. When the Han dynasty adopted Confucianism as the official state philosophy, the institutional patronage that philosophical schools required dried up for all competitors. By the 2nd century CE, Mohism had essentially ceased to exist as a living philosophical school. Its text survived, but its tradition of practice and transmission did not. This guide recovers Mohism in full, its central doctrines, its theological framework, its remarkable community structure, its astonishing contributions to logic and natural science, and the reasons for its suppression. For Halagricity, Mohism is significant for a specific reason. It is the most complete pre-modern Chinese articulation of universal love as a philosophical and practical principle. The recognition that the expansion of care beyond the boundaries of kinship and community to encompass all human beings is not merely an ideal, but a rational, practical, and cosmologically grounded necessity. Historical context, China's warring states period. Mohism emerged during the Warring States period, one of the most chaotic, violent, and intellectually creative periods in Chinese history. The Zhou dynasty's authority had collapsed, and in its place, a system of competing feudal states engaged in nearly continuous warfare, each attempting to conquer and absorb its neighbors in a centuries-long struggle for supremacy that would only be resolved by the Qin dynasty's military conquest of all rivals. The human cost of the Warring States period was enormous. Battles involved armies of hundreds of thousands, cities were sacked and burned, populations were massacred, refugees crowded the roads between states. The fundamental question that every philosopher of the period grappled with was, what has gone wrong, and how can it be fixed? Confucius answered, we have lost the ritual propriety and social relationships of the early Zhou period. Restore them. The Taoists answered, we are overcomplicating things. Return to simplicity and natural harmony. Legalists answered, we need stronger laws and more effective state mechanisms of control. Mozi answered, we have failed to extend our care beyond our own families and states. We must learn universal love. The 100 schools of thought, the chaos of the Warring States period produced, paradoxically, the most intellectually creative period in Chinese history. the 100 schools of thought. Every state was competing for effective advisors. Every philosopher was competing for patronage. Every idea was tested in practice against the results it produced. In this environment of competitive intellectual pluralism, Mohism emerged from the craftsman class and proposed a radically different answer to the period's crisis. Mozi the man and his background. Mozi is one of the most remarkable figures in Chinese intellectual history and one of the least known outside of specialist circles. He was a younger contemporary of Confucius and an older contemporary of Plato. He is therefore a genuinely axial age figure, emerging in the same great wave of philosophical creativity that produced Socrates, the Buddha, and Confucius. Background and class origins. Unlike Confucius and most other Chinese philosophers of the period, Mozi appears to have been of craftsman or artisan origin. The Mozi text specifically mentions his expertise in woodworking and mechanical engineering, and his school attracted primarily artisans, craftsmen, and people of humble background rather than aristocrats and scholars. This class origin is philosophically significant. Mozi's ethics is not an aristocratic ethics of ritual propriety and cultivated virtue, but a craftsman's ethics of practical utility. Honest labor and concrete results. The craftsman's philosophy. Mozi's craftsman background shaped his philosophical method in specific ways. He was deeply skeptical of elaborate ritual, of luxury goods, of music and entertainment, not because he was a killjoy, but because from a craftsman's perspective, these are expenditures of resources that produce no practical benefit. His philosophical method is correspondingly practical. Every doctrine is evaluated by whether it produces concrete benefits for the people. The test is not aesthetic, not traditional, not social, but utilitarian. The Mozi text, a collection of essays, arguments, and the Mozi, is the primary source for Mohist philosophy technical writings attributed to Mozi and his immediate disciples, compiled over several generations. It is not a single coherent text, but a collection of materials from different periods and different levels of the Mohist school, including the carefully argued philosophical essays of the early Mohists, the technical logical canon of the later Mohists, and practical military engineering manuals for the defense of besieged cities. This diversity reflects the Mohist school's remarkable range, simultaneously a philosophical school, a logical research program, and a quasi-military engineering corps. Jian-I Universal Love, the central teaching, the central doctrine of Mohism. The teaching that distinguishes it from every other Chinese philosophical school and that makes it uniquely significant for halagricity is Jian-I, universal love, impartial caring, or inclusive care. This is Mozi's foundational ethical principle, the teaching from which virtually all other Mohist doctrines flow, and the idea that places Mohism in a unique position in the global history of moral philosophy. What Jian-I actually means. The Chinese term Jian-I is composed of two characters, Jian and Ai. The combination means something like caring for all without discrimination, or love that encompasses everyone simultaneously. It is critical to understand what this is not. It is not the Confucian love that begins with family and extends outward by degree. It is not the Buddhist compassion that is cultivated through the progressive extension of goodwill from oneself outward through increasingly large circles. It is the claim that you should care about other people's parents as much as you care about your own, other people's children as much as your own, other people's states as much as your own, with no diminishment of care based on distance of relationship. Jian-I, the philosophical argument. Mozi's argument for universal love is not merely an appeal to idealism, it is a logical argument from self-interest. 1. You want other people to care for your parents, your family, and your state when you are unable to care for them yourself. 2. The way to ensure that others will care for your family is to care for theirs, because people respond to care with care. 3. Therefore, caring for others as you care for yourself is not altruistic self-sacrifice. It is the rational strategy for ensuring that your own family receives care. 4. When everyone adopts this principle, the result is a world in which everyone's family is cared for, which is what everyone wants. This is one of the earliest formulations of the Golden Rule as a rational rather than merely moral principle, and it predates Christianity's formulation by approximately 400 years. The contrast with Confucian love. Mozi's explicit target in his arguments for Jian-I is Confucian partial love, the Confucian teaching that love should be differentiated according to relationship. Mozi's critique is pointed. If everyone practices partial love, the result is that every person prioritizes their own family at the expense of others. Every state prioritizes its own interests at the expense of neighboring states, and the outcome is precisely the warfare, exploitation, and social fragmentation that China was experiencing. The warring states catastrophe, in Mozi's analysis, is the direct consequence of the widespread practice of partial love. Mozi argued that the social disasters of his time, warfare, theft, exploitation, the powerful oppressing the weak, all have the same root cause. People do not regard others' interests as equal to their own. If Lord A regarded Lord B's state as his own, he would not attack it. If a thief regarded the property of others as his own, he would not steal it. If the strong regarded the interests of the weak as their own, they would not exploit them. Universal love is not an impossible ideal. It is the only rational solution to the problem of conflict. Jian'ai and Christianity. The most frequently noted comparison in contemporary scholarship is between Mozi's Jian'ai and the Christian teaching of love for all people, including enemies. The parallel is striking. Both teachings argue for the extension of care beyond the natural circle of kinship and community to encompass all human beings without discrimination. Both root this universal love in a theological claim about the nature of the divine, and both teachings were considered impractical idealisms by their critics and transformative necessities by their proponents. Mozi's formulation precedes the Christian teaching by approximately 4 centuries and arrives at it through a completely independent philosophical tradition which makes the convergence philosophically significant. The principle of universal love is not a specifically Christian or Western innovation. It is a conclusion that careful ethical reasoning arrives at across completely independent traditions when it takes the question of social conflict seriously enough. Connection to halagricity. Jhana universal love as a rational principle, not merely an emotional aspiration, is the Mohist teaching that most directly resonates with halagricity's understanding of the PHHC framework developed at IQ Productions through Selk Reiki. The haligric understanding that compassion is not a feeling one has occasionally, but a fundamental orientation toward all beings, a practical, embodied, daily practice of caring that does not distinguish between the worthy and the unworthy, the familiar and the stranger, the lovable and the difficult, is the haligric articulation of what Mozi formulated as Jian-I. Mozi arrived at universal love through logic. Halagricity arrives at it through practice. The destination is the same, Fei Gong against offensive war. It had direct, practical. Mozi's doctrine of Jian-I was not an abstract philosophical position implications that Mozi argued for with characteristic logical forcefulness. The most politically significant was his doctrine of Fei Gong, the condemnation of offensive warfare, the logic of anti-war. Mozi's argument against offensive war is straightforward. If we regard killing one person as a crime that deserves punishment, why do we praise the killing of thousands as a military achievement? The moral logic is the same in both cases. Taking human life without justification is wrong. The scale does not change the moral quality of the act, it only changes the magnitude of the wrong. Mozi was not a pacifist, but he drew a sharp moral distinction between defense and offensive conquest. The Mohist Defense Corps, one of the most remarkable expressions of Mohist commitment to anti-war principles, was the Mohist Defense Corps, a trained quasi-military organization of Mohist practitioners who would travel to states under threat of unjust attack and assist in their defense. The Mozi text contains extensive technical manuals for the defense of besieged cities, how to build defensive walls, how to construct fire suppression systems, how to design arrow catapults and other defensive weapons, how to organize civilian defenders, how to manage food and water supplies during a siege. These manuals are the product of genuine military engineering expertise. The Mohist commitment to the principle of defensive war was backed by professional competence in its execution. The most famous story in the Mohist tradition illustrates this commitment. When the state of Chu was planning to attack the smaller state of Song using newly developed military technology developed by the craftsman Gongshu Ban, Mozi walked for 10 days to reach Gongshu Ban and argued him out of providing the technology. Then he walked to the Chu court and argued the king out of the attack, demonstrating, using Gongshu Ban's belt as a symbolic city wall and wooden implements as symbolic armies, that every attack strategy the Chu forces had would be countered by Mohist defensive techniques. Only when the Chu king threatened to simply have Mozi killed did Mozi reveal that he had already sent 300 of his disciples with defensive equipment to the walls of Song before leaving, making the attack futile regardless of what happened to him personally. The attack was called off. Jieyong against luxury and waste. Mozi's doctrine of Jiyong is the economic and social dimension of his universal love teaching. The logic is straightforward. Resources are finite, suffering is real. Luxury consumption by the few means privation for the many. A ruler who builds elaborate palaces, maintains vast retinues, and wears silk robes while his people are hungry has not merely made an aesthetic choice, he has made a moral one, and it is the wrong one. The utilitarian standard. Mozi's standard for evaluating expenditure is rigorously utilitarian. Does this use of resources produce concrete benefit for the people? Food that nourishes, yes. Clothing that protects from cold, yes. Dwellings that shelter from weather, yes. Elaborate funeral ceremonies that bury vast quantities of goods with the dead, no. Military campaigns of conquest that consume enormous resources and produce only death and destruction, no. Music and entertainment that employ large numbers of people to produce performances that serve no practical function, no. Mohist frugality in practice. Mohist practitioners were famous in the ancient world for the extreme simplicity of their personal lives. They wore rough clothing, ate simple food, worked with their hands, and refused the comforts and status markers that distinguish the educated class from the laboring class. Zhuangzi described Mohist practitioners as people who wore short coats of coarse cloth and sandals of hemp, toiling day and night without stopping, regarding this extreme self-denial as their standard. This is not an entirely sympathetic portrait. Zhuangzi found Mohist austerity joyless and inhuman, but it captures something real about the Mohist school's demanding standard of personal simplicity. Shang Xian exalting the worthy Mohist meritocracy. And it is, for the fifth from the ruler of a Mozi's doctrine of Shang Xian is his political theory century BCE, a radically democratic one. Mozi argued that positions of authority state down to local officials should be filled not on the basis of birth, family connection, or aristocratic status, but solely on the basis of the ability, virtue, and practical competence of the candidate. The argument from universal love. The Shang Xian doctrine follows directly from Jian Ai. If all people's welfare matters equally, then the selection of those who govern must be based on who can best serve that welfare, not on who was born to the right family. Hereditary aristocracy, in Mozi's analysis, is simply institutionalized partial love at the political level, the powerful caring for their own descendants at the expense of the wider community's need for competent governance. Mozi's meritocracy extends to the rejection of nepotism, even by the worthy. A good official who appoints incompetent relatives to positions is not practicing good governance. He is allowing partial love to override the principle of universal benefit that should govern all public decisions. The criterion is always what produces the greatest benefit for the greatest number, proto-democratic implications. Mozi's Shang Xian doctrine has proto-democratic implications that are remarkable for its historical context. If authority is justified only by competence in serving the people's welfare, then authority that fails in this function is not legitimate authority, it is tyranny which the people have no obligation to obey. Mozi does not develop this into a full theory of popular sovereignty, but the logical foundation is present. Governance is justified by its service to the governed, not by the birth status or divine mandate of the governors. Shang Tong conforming upward, Mohist political theory. Alongside Shang Xian, Mozi developed the complementary doctrine of Shang Tong, a theory of how a properly ordered society should function once the worthy have been selected for governance. The problem of moral disagreement. Mozi began with an observation. In the state of nature, every person has their own moral standard, and when these standards conflict, which they constantly do, the result is the war of all against all. Social order requires that people be able to coordinate around shared standards. The solution is Shang Tong. Each person identifies upward with the moral standards of their superiors, the village head, the district governor, the state ruler, the son of heaven, and ultimately with the moral standard of heaven itself. The critical limit, heaven's standard. Shang Tong is frequently criticized as a doctrine of authoritarian conformity, and it would be if the chain of upward identification ended with the ruler. But it does not. The ruler's authority is legitimate only insofar as the ruler identifies upward with heaven's standard, which Mozi identifies with universal love and universal benefit. A ruler who commands his people to harm others, to wage unjust war, or to benefit the few at the expense of the many is not the standard to which anyone should conform, because that ruler has broken the chain of upward identification by failing to identify with heaven's will. This creates a crucial check on Mohist conformity. The ultimate standard is not the ruler but heaven, and heaven's will is universal benefit and universal love. The ruler who fails to embody this standard has lost the chain of legitimate authority. and his commands deserve no more compliance than the commands of any private individual. Tianji, the will of heaven, Mohist theology. Mozi's theology is one of the most developed and most distinctive in classical Chinese philosophy. Unlike Confucius and unlike the Taoists, Mozi argued for a personal heaven with a will, a moral standard, and active concern for the welfare of all people. Heaven as universal lover. The most important feature of Mozi's theology is the claim that heaven loves all people equally and without discrimination, that heaven's love is itself the cosmic model of Jian Ai. This is not merely a metaphysical claim, it is the theological foundation of Mozi's ethics. Jian Ai is not merely a rational strategy for social harmony, it is the human participation in the fundamental love that structures the cosmos. To practice universal love is to align oneself with heaven's own nature and will. Mozi argued that the evidence for heaven's universal love is visible in the natural world. The sun and rain fall on all people without discrimination. The earth provides nourishment for all. The seasons benefit all. These are not merely natural facts, they are expressions of heaven's active care for all its creatures. The human failure of partial love is therefore not only socially destructive, it is a violation of cosmic order, a failure to participate in the universal love that is the fundamental character of reality. Mohist theology versus Confucian agnosticism. One of the most pointed differences between Mozi and Confucius is their treatment of heaven. Confucius' famous statement that the master never discussed strange phenomena, feats of strength, disorder, or spiritual beings reflects a characteristic Confucian pragmatism. Whatever we cannot know directly, we should not claim to know. Mozi's response is that heaven's will is knowable through its observable effects, the natural world's universal provision, and that the refusal to engage with theology is itself a kind of irresponsibility. If we do not know what heaven wants, we have no cosmic standard against which to evaluate human institutions. Connection to haligricity. Mozi's theology, a personal heaven that loves all beings equally, whose love is the cosmic standard that human ethics must aspire to embody, is the Chinese philosophical tradition's closest analogue to what haligricity holds about the divine as a force of universal, non-discriminating love that pervades and sustains all existence. The haligric understanding that the divine is not a force that rewards the worthy and punishes the unworthy, but a fundamental creative love that is equally present to all that sacred practice is the work of aligning with and expressing this universal love rather than earning the favor of a partial deity, is philosophically identical to Mozi's Tianji. The Mohist heaven and the haligric divine are recognizing the same fundamental reality from different cultural and historical positions. Mingui, affirming the existence of spirits. Mozi's doctrine of Mingui is surprising given his generally rationalist orientation, but it follows logically from his system. If heaven has a will and cares about human moral conduct, there must be agents through which heaven's moral concern is expressed and enforced in the world. These agents are the spirits, supernatural beings who observe human conduct, reward virtue, and punish vice. The pragmatic argument for spirits. Mozi's argument for the existence of spirits is characteristically pragmatic. Even if we cannot be certain whether spirits exist, the belief in their existence has beneficial social consequences, while the denial of their existence has harmful consequences. Therefore, social policy should encourage belief in spirits regardless of the metaphysical question. This argument anticipates a recognizable style of pragmatic reasoning that would be developed in Western philosophy much later. Mozi is not primarily interested in the metaphysical question of whether spirits exist. He is interested in the social and moral consequences of the belief, and he argues that the consequences are beneficial. Spirits and universal love. Mozi's spirits are moral agents. They care about universal benefit and universal love and actively reward those who practice them and punish those who violate them. This makes them very different from the spirits of Chinese folk religion, and very different from the morally complex gods of classical Chinese mythology. Mohist spirits are, in effect, cosmic enforcers of Jian Ai, agents of heaven's universal love operating at the level of human moral life. Fei Yue against music, the most misunderstood doctrine. Mozi's doctrine of Fei Yue against music is the teaching that has most damaged his reputation across the centuries and that most requires careful contextualization to be understood fairly. Mozi did not hate music. He was not aesthetically indifferent or culturally barbaric. His argument against music was specifically about the use of music in the context of aristocratic luxury and state expenditure, and it followed directly from his utilitarian standard of Ji Yong. The actual argument, Mozi's Fei Yue essay is specifically directed against the elaborate court music of Confucian aristocratic culture, performances requiring large orchestras, expensive instruments, elaborate costumes, and long rehearsal periods, all of which consume enormous resources without producing any tangible benefit for the people who are not in the court. Mozi's specific objection is that while the aristocracy is being entertained by elaborate musical performances, the people they govern are hungry, cold, and exhausted from labor. The ruler who commands 1,000 musicians to perform while his people starve has prioritized his own pleasure over the welfare of those he is supposed to serve, a direct violation of both Shangshan and Jian'ai. What Mozi was not saying, Mozi was not arguing that music is intrinsically bad, that aesthetic pleasure is sinful, or that human beings should have no joy in their lives. He was arguing that the specific institution of elaborately resourced court music in the context of widespread poverty and suffering was a moral failure. His standard was consistent. Does this expenditure of resources benefit the people? Court performances for the aristocracy do not. Music that brings joy to ordinary people in ordinary life is a different matter entirely, and Mozi does not condemn it. The broader context. The Fei Yue doctrine must also be understood in the context of Mozi's competition with Confucianism. Confucius placed extraordinary emphasis on ritual music as a vehicle of moral cultivation and social harmony. The proper performance of ritual music was, for Confucius, one of the primary means by which the gentleman cultivated virtue and the ruler organized the social order. Mozi's attack on music was therefore also an attack on the Confucian claim that elaborate ritual observance was the primary vehicle of social improvement, a claim Mozi found spectacularly inadequate in the face of the real suffering of the warring states period. Mohist logic and the canon. The later Mohist school made contributions to logic and the philosophy of language that are arguably the most sophisticated in classical Chinese philosophy, and that were so far ahead of their time that they were essentially forgotten for 2 millennia, only being rediscovered and appreciated by modern scholars in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The Mohist canon. The Mohist canon is a systematic philosophical text that develops definitions of key philosophical concepts and logical principles with a rigor and precision that has no parallel in classical Chinese philosophy. It is essentially a philosophical dictionary and logical treatise combined, an attempt to create a systematic language for philosophical argument that would make philosophical disputes resolvable rather than merely expressive. The Mohist theory of knowledge. The Mohist canon distinguishes 3 sources of knowledge: knowledge through hearsay, knowledge through inference, and knowledge through direct experience. It also distinguishes between knowledge that and knowledge, how a distinction that would not be made explicitly in Western philosophy until Bertrand Russell and Gilbert Ryle in the 20th century. Mohist logic and the 3 standards. Earlier Mohist texts develop a 3-standard method for evaluating philosophical and political arguments: the standard of foundation, the standard of observation, and the standard of application. This 3-standard method is a remarkably sophisticated early version of what we would now call evidence-based reasoning, combining historical evidence, observational evidence, and pragmatic consequence as 3 independent tests of a claim's validity. Mohist science, optics, mechanics, and geometry. The later Mohist canon contains materials that constitute the earliest systematic scientific investigation in Chinese history, predating the development of natural science in the West by several centuries in some areas. Mohist optics. The Mohist canon contains the earliest known discussion of optics in Chinese history, including descriptions of the camera obscura, the relationship between the size of an object and the size of its shadow, the reflection of light from mirrors, and the refraction of light in water. These observations are not merely described but analyzed. The canon provides systematic explanations in terms of the behavior of light rays, demonstrating a level of systematic experimental inquiry that anticipates modern scientific method. Mohist mechanics and military engineering. The Mohist military engineering texts contain detailed descriptions of defensive technologies, city wall construction and reinforcement, water gate mechanisms, fire suppression systems, catapults and crossbows for defensive use, underground tunnels for sallies against besieging forces, and techniques for detecting enemy tunneling. These texts are not merely theoretical, they reflect practical engineering knowledge developed and tested in actual defensive situations. Geometry and mathematics. The Mohist canon contains some of the earliest geometric definitions in Chinese intellectual history, definitions of the point, the line, the plane, and basic geometric relationships that are comparable in rigor to the Euclidean tradition in Greece. The parallel development of geometric thinking in 5th to 4th century BCE China and 5th to 4th century BCE Greece is one of the most remarkable instances of independent intellectual convergence in the history of human thought. The Mohist community, a school like no other. The Mohist school was not merely a philosophical tradition, it was a distinctive community of practice with its own organizational structure, its own leadership hierarchy, its own code of conduct, and its own culture of extreme personal discipline. It was in many respects the closest analog in ancient China to a monastic religious order. The Grand Master. The Mohist school was led by a Grand Master who was elected by the school's members on the basis of virtue, learning, and practical competence. The Mohist tradition records 3 Grand Masters, Mozi himself, and 2 successors. The Grand Master's authority was absolute within the community. Members were expected to act on the Grand Master's directives without question, including dying at the Grand Master's command when the honor of the community or the principle of a sacred obligation required it. This last feature, the willingness to die at the Grand Master's command, is the most extreme expression of the Mohist school's understanding of its own discipline. The Mozi text records the case of Meng Sheng, who felt bound by oath to defend a city and, when the defense became impossible, sent his followers to die with him rather than live in violation of their sworn obligation. This is not mere fanaticism, it is the consistent application of Mohist ethics to the community's own conduct. If universal love means being willing to die for others' welfare, the Mohist practitioner must be willing to do what they demand of everyone else. The Mohist Code of Conduct. Mohist practitioners were expected to embody the principles they preached: personal austerity, active service, physical discipline, and absolute personal integrity. The Mohist community was in this sense a living philosophical experiment, an attempt to demonstrate through collective practice that Jan'ai was not merely an attractive ideal, but a viable way of life. The suppression of Mohism. The disappearance of Mohism as a living philosophical school is one of the most significant and most under-discussed events in intellectual history. A tradition that competed successfully with Confucianism for 2 centuries, produced the most sophisticated logic and science of its period, and proposed the most radical ethical system in the classical world, simply ceased to exist as a living practice within a century of the Qin unification. The political reasons. Mohism was politically inconvenient for the imperial order in several specific ways. Its anti-war doctrine made it a permanent critic of military expansion, uncomfortable for any empire-building state. Its meritocracy doctrine challenged hereditary aristocratic privilege, threatening to the class whose cooperation the Han imperial system needed. Its doctrine of heaven's universal love, as the standard against which rulers must be judged, provided a permanent theological basis for criticizing imperial conduct, dangerous in a political system that claimed the mandate of heaven as the justification for imperial authority. The institutional reasons. Beyond politics, Mohism's disappearance reflects an institutional reality. Philosophical schools in ancient China depended on patronage for their survival. When Confucianism became the official state philosophy of the Han dynasty, it received imperial patronage. The 5 classics became the basis of the civil service examination system. Confucian scholars staffed the imperial bureaucracy, and Confucian academies received state support. Mohism received none of this. Without institutional support, without a patron class, and with a community code that demanded extreme personal austerity rather than the social prestige that attracted talented students, the Mohist school simply could not maintain itself. What was lost? The suppression of Mohism meant that several of its most distinctive contributions were effectively lost to Chinese civilization for 2 millennia. Its formal logic, its systematic science, and above all, its universal ethics, the claim that the circle of moral concern must extend equally to all human beings regardless of their relationship to the moral agent. Chinese ethical discourse was dominated by Confucian partial love for the next 2,000 years, and the alternative Mohist vision was available only as a historical curiosity. Mohism's modern revival and relevance. Since the late 19th century, and with increasing intensity in the 21st century, Mohism has experienced a significant scholarly and philosophical revival in China, Taiwan, and in Western academic philosophy. This revival has several distinct dimensions. The logic revival. When Western formal logic arrived in China in the late 19th century with Jesuit missionaries and later with secular modernizers, Chinese scholars began searching for native Chinese precedents and found them in the Mohist canon. The canon's sophisticated treatment of names, knowledge, inference, and definition was recognized as a genuine indigenous Chinese logical tradition. This discovery gave Chinese intellectuals of the modernization period a way to engage with Western logical methods without simply capitulating to Western intellectual authority. China had its own logical tradition, and it was Mohist. Universal love in contemporary ethics. Contemporary moral philosophers have rediscovered Jian'ai as a precursor to and parallel with Western utilitarian ethics and the emerging global ethical movement of effective altruism, the view that we have moral obligations to beings regardless of their geographic or relational distance from us. Peter Singer's famous argument that proximity should not determine moral weight, and the effective altruism movement's claim that we are morally obligated to prevent suffering wherever we can do so effectively, are Western philosophy's independent rediscovery of what Mozi argued 2,400 years ago. Mohism and artificial intelligence ethics. In contemporary China, Mohism has attracted interest from AI researchers and technology ethicists who see Jian'ai as a possible foundation for AI alignment ethics, a principle that would require AI systems to serve all people's welfare equally, rather than optimizing for specific groups' preferences. Whether this application is philosophically sound is debated, but the fact that a 5th century BCE craftsman's philosophy is being discussed in the context of 21st century AI ethics is itself a remarkable testimony to Mohism's intellectual reach. Haligricity convergences. Jian'ai and the PHHC framework. Mohism's Jian'ai, universal love as a rational principle embodied in daily practice, not merely held as an aspiration, is the Chinese philosophical tradition's most complete articulation of what haligricity holds in the PHHC framework, developed at IQ Productions through Selk Reiki. Compassion, in the haligric framework, is not a feeling one has toward those one naturally likes. It is a fundamental orientation toward all beings, a practical daily practice of seeing and responding to the reality of others, experience with the same attentiveness one gives to one's own. This is exactly what Mozi meant by Jian'ai, heaven's universal love and haligric cosmology. Mozi's theological claim that heaven loves all beings equally, that universal love is not merely a human ethical aspiration but the fundamental character of the cosmos, is the Chinese philosophical articulation of what haligricity holds about the divine as a force of non-discriminating creative love. The haligric practitioner who works with the understanding that the universe is fundamentally organized by love, that the sacred is not a force that rewards the worthy and punishes the unworthy, but a creative love that is equally available to all, is working within the same cosmological recognition as Mozi's Tianzi. Mohist meritocracy and the worthiness of service. The Mohist doctrine of Shangxian, that authority is justified only by its effective service to the welfare of all, is the classical Chinese articulation of what haligricity holds about the relationship between genuine power and genuine service. The haligric practitioner who develops spiritual authority and sacred knowledge understands that this development is not a personal achievement to be deployed for personal gain, but a capacity to be offered in service to the community's well-being. The Mohist standard applies: the authority is justified only by the quality of the service it enables. Utilitarian clarity and sacred practice. Mozi's three-standard method for evaluating claims, historical precedent, observational confirmation, and practical consequence, is the most ancient Chinese formulation of what haligricity holds about the relationship between sacred practice and real-world results. The haligric understanding that practice must be tested against experience, that what does not produce genuine, observable transformation is not worth maintaining regardless of how ancient or prestigious its source, reflects the same pragmatic rigor that Mozi applied to Confucian ritual in 5th century BCE China. Sacred tradition is not protected from the question, does this actually work? The forgotten and the recovered. Mohism's suppression, a complete living philosophical tradition essentially erased from Chinese intellectual life for 2 millennia and its contemporary revival, is itself a teaching for haligricity. The traditions that haligricity honors the shamanic roots of all religious practice, the African philosophical traditions, the indigenous American and Australian sacred knowledge have all experienced versions of Mohism's suppression. The recovery of suppressed sacred wisdom is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of justice and an act of sacred restoration, returning to the global conversation the voices that were silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient to the powers that suppressed them. If you love others, they will love you. If you benefit others, they will benefit you. If you hate others, they will hate you. If you harm others, they will harm you. Mozi, 6th century BCE. Mozi did not propose universal love because it was easy or because it was the path of least resistance. He proposed it because it was the only rational response to the reality of human interdependence, because the suffering of the person across the world is as real as the suffering of the person next to you, and a philosophy that acknowledges one while ignoring the other is not a philosophy of love at all. 4 centuries later, this proposition remains as radical, as logical, and as urgently necessary as it was in the Warring States. Grand Rising. Personal reading series, Haligricity 2Q Productions, or my 2000